everyone, this is Addie Cron Podfics, back with another podfic. Today I will be reading The Taboos of Percy Jackson. This is part 2. This will be my extra fic for the week because it is winter break and I read the first part of this fic and then kind of just forgot about it. So yeah, I needed to finish it. Anyway, let's get right into it. Taboo 2. Never threaten Annabeth Chase. Something just had to go wrong. Then again, it would not be Percy Jackson if nothing went wrong. Piper POV. The sounds of metal clanging rang out in the air. Smoke from the Greek fire-ringed bombs by yours sincerely, the one and only Leo McShizzle Valdez, rising amongst the clamoring of monsters, and above it all, the barking of orders from Clarice Theroux, head of the Ares cabin. Cursing under her breath, Piper unsheathed her catoptrice before leaping into the fray. After Gaia's defeat, the borders of the camp had been weakened considerably, and the remaining forces of Gaia's mostly decimated army had taken the opening to attack. Dozens of Drachnae slithered forward, brandishing their spears coated in poison, while hellhounds bounded down the hill, snapping their teeth, Impusai clombing down behind them, fangs bared and claws glinting in the light of the setting sun. And Percy, who could probably have vaporized at least half of them in a breath, was currently out of camp on a mission to bring in a pair of unclaimed demigods. Damn. Ducking, Piper dodged a strike from a Hyperborean, slicing at its Achilles tendon and lobbing off its head before spinning around and deftly kicking a knife out of an Impusai's hands, taking advantage of its distraction to stab her blade to its collarbone. Piles of gold dust were collecting around Thalia's pine. The battle cries of monsters dwindling as victorious smiles came upon the campers' faces, and the last of the monsters were eradicated. Then things went downhill. The smoke cleared, and Piper's mouth dried as she watched the scene in front of her unfold with glowing horror. While Annabeth had been occupied with a hellhound slashing at its flank and parrying a strike from another Cyclops, the leader of the group, the Manticore, had been sneaking up from behind. Before Piper could even open her mouth to charm-speak the Manticore or warn Annabeth, she never got the chance to find out. The Manticore had lashed out, grabbing Annabeth in a chokehold as the daughter of Athena flailed in its grasp. "Hold your weapons," the Manticore rasped out, pulling Annabeth into the center of the battle, "or the girl dies." His spiked tail lifted, positioning itself to pierce Annabeth's heart. The Manticore's beady, pitch-black eyes darted around, a crazed light in them as he took in the dozens of demigods, frozen in shock and terror, eyes wide with disbelief. Unease settled in the hearts of the demigods as they watched one of their unofficial leaders taken captive. Out of the corner of her eye, Piper noticed the Apollo campers perched in trees fumbling for arrows, trying to aim for the Manticore, but deep in her heart, Piper knew that it would never work. With the Manticore never staying still and Annabeth's body blocking any shots to him, there was no way the campers would make a clean shot, at least not to one of the Manticore's vital organs. Panic simmered in Piper's chest as she took stock of the admittedly dire situation. God, it was like the Nymphorium all over again, just that this time around she could not see a way out. Then an icy wind blew across the field, and all movement halted. Even the Manticore, who had been sneering and pressing the tip of its tail closer against Annabeth's collarbone, stopped, his eyes scanning the field warily. A low growl sounded from the woods, and momentarily forgetting about the Manticore's threat, they whipped their heads around. The growl had been feral, and a shiver involuntarily ran down Piper's spine. Great, she thought sarcastically. Just what they needed. Another, probably way more powerful monster. Finding Jason's eyes in the sea of assembled demigods, they shared a frantic glance before drawing out their weapons, once again, and facing the woods, where only a rustling of trees indicated the vague position of the new monster. Beside them, the Manticore's eyes had widened in fear. Fear? A monster's even scared of anything. I'm not even going to try and say this, because it's in Greek, and I cannot pronounce Greek, so we're just going to continue. Piper only understood a few phrases of the ancient Greek the Manticore was speaking, and it made absolutely no sense. The destroyer? Her mind was running at approximately 1,000 miles per hour, but she was still drawing a blank at whatever this monster was. To have terrified the Manticore so much, the only other being she had seen strike a semblance of fear into the monsters was probably Gaia, and even then it was more respect than fear. Whatever or whoever this was seemed to have similar effects on the remaining monsters, who shuddered in fear, and Impusa even raking her blood-painted nails down her face as she wailed, "No, I don't want to go back there again!" While the monsters bristled, the Manticore had long ago forgotten about his supposed hostage, his arms, claws, forelegs, going slack as he nearly tripped in his haste to get away from Annabeth, as realization seemed to dawn on her, grinning. This was probably one of the top 10 in the most confusing things that happened in her life list, which, frankly speaking, was saying a lot. First, the Manticore had taken Annabeth captive, then seemed intimidated by new prisons, with Annabeth seemed to be smug at. Yep, definitely made the list. Her thoughts were cut off as a figure emerged from the woods, shrouded by a still-clearing smoke. All around her, campers perked up, eyes cautiously tracing the figure's every movement. It, or he, was certainly not the humanoid shape Piper had imagined. Instead, it looked like a normal man's, piquing her curiosity even further. Yet the aura it seemed to exclude was anything but that of a normal man's. It was powerful, the way only the gods would be when flaring theirs. The kind she had only felt with Gaia herself. It weighed down on her, pressing her down. Piper barely resisted the urge to sink into the floor and curl up in submission. It was like a looming threat, her body adopting a mind of its own as she took a step back, like many others around her, and even Raina's willpower crumbling as she backpedaled next to Piper. It was harsh, cold, like the winds which had picked up around them, like the frost which had begun eating away at the demigods' hearts. It was sharp, serrating, the edges lined with ice and shards. Staring at the outline in the clearing mist, an ominous feeling seemingly emitting from the figure, the low, dark growl which had rose from its throat, the aura warning them not to get close, yet pulling them in all the same. Piper could not help but remember of the stories her father had told her as a child. The Ukatena, he had said. The horned serpent, perhaps the most feared monster in the Cherokee legends. It has pools of darkness as eyes, leathery, scaly drapes as wings, a tough, impenetrable hide, a majestic yet intimidating air, and a diamond encrusted on its forehead. For whoever is seen by the Ukatene is so dazed by the bright light that he runs towards the snake instead of trying to escape. And the rest is history. Piper felt like that now, attracted, pulled in closer by the aura, yet itching to get away from it, a dangerous air around it, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her body inching forward of its own volition. An unnatural stillness came from right behind her, where Leo had been. Peering out of the corner of her eye at her friend, though her sight was still trained on the enticing, mesmerizing, terrifying figure, she noted with a fear-inspiring awe that the hyperactive elf of a demigod's movements had stilled, hands no longer fidgeting at it as it perpetually was, and for once no snark comments or snide remarks coming forth from him, just staring forward, mouth hung open slightly, arms held loosely at his sides. Casting a quick, reassuring glance at Hazel, whose hands had started trembling. Sometimes Piper forgot she was still 13. Piper fixed her kaleidoscope eyes on the approaching figure, scenarios playing out in her head. Maybe she could charm speak it, or rally the demigods to all attack it at once. Feet tapping on the floor nervously, she tried and failed to compose herself, just as its presence alone was making her shaky, unsteady on her own feet. Then the figure stepped out fully, and Piper's breath caught in her throat. Just by his silhouette alone, Piper could tell that he was definitely someone who'd never had a shortage of girls. The figure was tall, but not too tall, lean, but at the same time evidently muscular, his toned body steadily moving forward, his movements fluid, reminding Piper of a lake, flowing lazily, calmly, smoothly, confidently, and at the same time ready to brew up a storm. The figure finally came into view, and Piper, along with many other campers, let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Black, perfectly rumpled hair was the first thing that came into view. Piper was half certain it'd be soft to the touch, like silk. Then the rest of the features came into view, and her mouth went dry. A quick glance to the side told her many other campers' eyes were blown wide, openly gawking at the sight before them. Sea-green eyes shone out from under long, thick lashes, brushing against high-cut cheekbones. The beautiful face, however, was twisted into something inhuman, something that rang all the bells in her head, practically screaming out, "Get the sticks out of here!" Beside her, Jason drew in a sharp breath, hand resting on his gladius as he squinted to get a better look at the approaching man. Percy frickin' Jackson! Piper would never understand how she once thought of this man as unimpressive. The depths of his eyes, like a calm sea lazing around under the sun, had darkened, deepened, now reflecting choppy waves, stormy seas, pools of poison, tendrils reaching out as if trying to grab her, overwhelm her, drown her, choke her. They promised everlasting suffering, torment, the begging for the sweet release of death that he so certainly would not give. The mad spark in them assured a painful suffering, a slow torture, a bloodthirst that would never be satiated no matter how much you bled out, or pleaded, or sobbed, or fought. Piper, like many around her, found that she was not able to hold that gaze for more than a few seconds, though, and was hardly directed at her, instead pinning the manticore in place, the latter whimpering and ducking his head and slowly backing away, while Annabeth watched to the side serenely. There was a hard, cold, calculating edge to set eyes, seeming to analyze her, look through her, see past all her lies and facades and masks, tearing them down, slowly but methodically crumbling all her walls, breaking her into pieces before the fight even started. One that was finding all her weak points, that was considering her strengths, that had come up with at least 101 ways to take her down in a fight. One that took her in, summed her up, dismissed her as a mere annoyance, not getting distracted from his prey. And his lips, usually plastered in a troublemaker smile making sarcastic quips, were now curved up sharply, cruelly, a sadistic glint to it. Piper knew that this man was one that would watch you drown, thrash in pain, and hold out a float to you, so close, but yet so far. Then he would laugh maliciously, draw his hand back, use his foot to push your barely surfacing head back in, and sit back, watching with rapt interest as you slowly went under. Then he would pull you up just to dunk you back in and repeat the whole thing again, and all the while those pink, luscious lips would never stray away from that unmoving, savage grin, which was just borderline baring his teeth. For once, as Piper opened her mouth, she found herself speechless. Instead, her mouth gaping like a fish. Now Percy Jackson was staring down the manticore, head tilted slightly as he seemed to drink in the sight of the quivering monster, like a wolf sniffing the fear out of its prey, playing with it till it was no more than a shell before going in for the kill. And that was when the realization hit Piper like a freight train. Percy Jackson this, Percy Jackson that, Percy Jackson toppled volcanoes, Percy Jackson brought down Titans single-handedly. For all that praise, that worship, that reverence, Piper had found the guys admittedly underwhelming. The guy who tried using Diet Coke to repel pirates, the guy who mistook the feast for tuna as a feast for tuna. She, for her life, was unable to reconcile the two Percy Jacksons. For a worshipped hero, Percy Jackson didn't really live up to the legend, or so she thought. Only now did she realize that all this was just lurking behind the mask of bright, innocent eyes, troublemaker, unknowing smiles, dumb, sassy retorts. That mask made to be underestimated, to be glossed over, to be belittled. And Piper, like everyone else, all Percy Jackson's family, friends, allies, enemies alike, had fallen for it. Like fish lured to a bait. They had unknowingly, unsuspectingly, but all the same, been beguiled by the mask. Now that it had been ripped off, unleashed, Piper could not believe she had ever thought of Percy Jackson as weak. Percy Jackson was the embodiment of strong. It showed in his eyes that shone with experience and knowledge despite the number of times people had ridiculed his stupidity. It showed in his lips, which always managed to stay upturned no matter what he was going through. No matter the pain he was going through. It showed in his gait. That he had seen everything, had felt everything, that he had nothing to fear, and now Piper was just brushing the surface of Percy Jackson. Frank had let out a small "Oh!" from beside her, but neither her nor Percy turned to look as the son of Poseidon sauntered towards the manticore, who looked scared out of his skin. Well, Piper didn't blame him. If she had that killer glare fixed on her, she would definitely have winged it a long time ago, too. Manticore. Again, I'm not even gonna try and pronounce that. Yeah. Percy drawled, dragging the words out as if he drew a dagger. Percy drawled, dragging the words out as he drew a dagger from one of his shirt sleeves. Piper had no idea he even kept weapons there. But then again, was all she had just been doing not severely underestimating the man in front of her? And continued walking towards the manticore, whose back by now was flushed against a tree. I have no business with you, the destroyer. I'll leave now, and take my monsters with me, the manticore stuttered out, whipping around and darting, rather trying to, off in another direction. All Percy did, though, was cluck his tongue, a look of feigned disappointment settling on his face. Did I say you could leave? The words were like a whisper, soft and melodious, yet sharp and cutting at the same time. The manticore suddenly froze, one foot still lifted off the ground, trapped in place by an unseen force. As its breath started becoming more labored, with a twirl of Perseus's fingers, the manticore turned back around to face him, as if being wrenched about by some invisible puppet strings. Maybe, Percy started. I had no business here, but the obvious hope and relief which had leaped into the manticore's eyes were quickly extinguished. You touched Annabeth, so now it is my business. The manticore's eyes set in horror and pain. Piper was surprised it hadn't pissed itself yet. Stammered, I'm sorry, I didn't know it was her. Liar, Percy ground out, and before Piper could even catch his movement, drew a cut over the manticore's eyes. Crying out in pain, the manticore unsuccessfully tried to lean away from its torturer. All Percy did was let out a small snort before poison started dripping out from the manticore's tail, steaming and hissing as it hit the ground, leaving behind charred grass and yellow flowers. Piper wanted to cry out a warning, but bit it back, eyes widening as the poison started moving in what seemed like Percy's favor. Looking on with equal amounts of fascination, wariness, and growing terror, Piper watched the poison slowly morph into shapes. First, a girl hanging off a manticore's back as it leapt off a cliff. The same girl, bowing down under a weight obviously not meant for her, face contorted with pain. The manticore threatening two other doe-eyed, obviously new to the mythological world children. These images made no sense whatsoever to Piper, nor did it look like it held any significance to the rest, judging by the confused looks on their faces. But whatever it was seemed to make the manticore, if possible, even more jittery as it struggled to explain itself. The poison, now elongated into a spear-like shape with a dangerously sharp tip, had pierced the manticore's skin, burying itself in completely, yet not emerging from the other side, as the manticore for a moment looked as bewildered as the rest of the demigods. Then the screaming started. Oh, Piper knew she would never be able to get it out of her ears. It would be the sound that infiltrated her many nightmares to come, that chilled her to the core, that made her hackles rise as she flinched, quickly averting her eyes. The blood-curdling cries of agony seemed to play on repeat in Piper's ears as she watched the manticore thrash on the floor, anguished moans and inhuman sobs sounding out, pleading for mercy even as he gurgled on the foam leaking from his mouth. But the destroyer just stood in front of the manticore, lips curved impossibly wider into a feral smile as he relished in the cries of mercy. Piper held back a wince as she watched the manticore writhing on the ground, pain gasps escaping him as his body contorted into unnatural shapes. Can't take some of your own medicine? Percy curled his lip disdainfully at the whimpering monster before snorting as blood started trickling out of the manticore's mouth, eyes, nose, and ears. Oh, gods! Piper herself was unable to hold in a retch any longer. She barely suppressed the urge to puke. All around her, the campers took in a collective gasp, eyes bugging out as some of the older campers attempted to shield the younger ones from the gore before them, unable to look away from the torture, yet praying to be given some relief. It almost seemed like a relief when the choked groans from the manticore were cut off, though instead of dissipating in gold dust, the decimated corpse of the manticore lay, still twitching, on the grass. Above it, Percy stood, casually flicking blood off his dagger as he watched the blood splatter before him while licking his lips, the bloodthirst temporarily satiated. Turning to the remaining monsters, who were now reduced to gaping, scared-out-of-their-boots messes, he rolled those perfect sea-green eyes as they tried to escape, exploding them inside out with a snap of his fingers. With agonized shrieks, gold dust flew everywhere. Percy, unflinching, even as they landed on his clothes, muttered something under his breath. Instead, seething, muttering under his breath something about dying too fast. Piper felt like she was being snapped out of a dream as Annabeth stepped forward, resting a placating hand on Percy's arm and whispering something into his ear. Percy's hardened features softened, and the skater boy persona seemed to emerge again, walking back into the woods with a spring in his steps, as if he had not just tortured a monster to death and exploded a dozen others. Piper and Jason watched in utter disbelief as Percy walked out into the woods again, this time with a young boy, no older than 10, on his shoulders, giggles bubbling from his chest as he grabbed onto Percy's hair, and a girl, probably 12, clinging to Percy's hand, grasping it like a lifeline as they came into the clearing. Guys, meet James and Amber, Percy introduced, grinning as he gestured to the two kids. Setting them down, he ruffled their hair before patting their backs and letting them off, smiling fondly as the two children were overwhelmed by concerned camp counselors. Approaching the son of Poseidon slightly warily, along with the rest of the seven and Reyna, she questioned, "Percy, what was that?" Percy seemed to misunderstand, blinking those baby seal eyes at her as he chirped, "James and Amber, the demigods I found. They're children of Apollo, full siblings, absolute sweethearts." With a wave of his hand, Percy Jackson called the kids over, and Piper exchanged looks with the seven and Reyna. What the Hades was that? Frank shrugged helplessly while color started to return to Hazel's pale face. Leo and Jason, on the other hand, seemed to be having a silent conversation, which Piper could only catch a few words of. "Call the prank off," and "don't want to see that glare again." All the while, Annabeth just looked after the laughing, green-eyed boys, shaking her head fondly as an amused smile touched her lips. The daughter of Aphrodite could not help but shudder internally as the grinning, slightly manic face of Percy Jackson showed up in her head once again. Well then, she resolved, she would do anything not to bring his mask down again. And that was part 2, chapter 3 of The Taboos of Percy Jackson. If there's any more of this, if the creator ever releases any more of this, I will be podficking it, but for now, that is all there is. Anyway, I hope you guys have a good night. Bye!